Daddy's Little Learner. Chapter 8. Reading to Dad. One of the things Dad liked us to do was read the evening paper to him each day when he got back from the pub, because he couldn't do it for himself. He'd look at the pictures and ask us what the headlines were saying. If they interested him, then he would tell us to read on. I suppose it was quite good practice for us, although some of the words were hard. I remember having trouble getting my head round the way they spelled jail and gale. Believe it or not, that was how the next level of abuse started, with me reading to my father. He had a collection of pornographic magazines, and he would order me upstairs the moment he walked in through the front door, usually when he was fueled up with drink. But not always. He would get me to sit on the edge of the bed and read explicit stories to him while he lay beside me and masturbated. Not that I realised that was the name for what he was doing. I was only 8 or 9 years old. I didn't understand what he was doing to himself at all, any more than I understood any of the things that I was having to read out to him. I just knew that none of it felt right, and I didn't like it. To begin with, I would beg him not to make me do it, and I would be unable to stop the tears from flowing. Then he would become angry and shout, and I would be terrified of what he might do if I didn't keep reading. There was no reasoning with him when he was in that frame of mind, and I knew I had no choice but to obey. It was preferable to taking a beating from the slipper or the stick. I would try not to look at him, or what he was doing, although it was impossible to ignore the shaking of the bed beneath us, and I would try not to focus on the pictures in the magazine, concentrating on the words on the page and trying to block out everything else. I just wanted the whole thing to be over as quickly as possible. Then he started making me lie down next to him while I read, and would reach across with his spare hand to play around with me inside my knickers, which made me feel uncomfortable and fearful, even though it didn't hurt to start with. After it was all over, he would give me a big lecture, each time about not telling anyone what we did together. He would tell me about a little girl we knew from down the road whose daddy had gone to prison because she told stories about him. "If I go to prison, you and Terry will be sent to children's home and everyone will hate you," he would warn. "Children's homes are full of perverts who will torture you and rape you. You need to have your daddy here to protect you. You're fat and you're ugly and no one except me is ever going to love you." I believed him completely. Even though I hated the things he did, I still didn't want him to go back to prison. We were a family, and I wanted us to be together. His stories about children's homes were terrifying, even though I never had that bad a time myself whenever we had been taken into one. I always thought that the next one we went to might be where all the terrible things he described would happen. As the level of his interference with me escalated, he kept saying there was no point in telling anyone what was happening between us anyway, because they would never believe me. "This is our secret," he'd tell me. "No one will believe anything you say until you're 10 anyway." Later, when he was finally called to answer for what he'd done to me, he claimed that I had misunderstood what he was doing, that it was just that he had had an open attitude to nudity and sex. That was certainly true, in that he saw nothing wrong with doing whatever he wanted, but that didn't mean I liked it. No child wants their parents to walk around the house with no clothes on, or to pee out the window or fiddle around inside their knickers. Once I'd realised there was no point in asking him to stop during these sessions or any attempting to run away, I tried to let him get on with it and concentrate on other things, pretending to myself that it wasn't happening, hoping it would all be over as quickly as possible. I convinced myself that maybe it wasn't so terrible. Then, one day, when I was still only about 9, he came in from the pub as usual and asked if I wanted a lollipop. Yes, please, Daddy, I replied eagerly. As he took my hand and marched me upstairs, I felt confused. Surely there weren't any lollipops up there, and I hadn't heard the ice cream van in the street outside. My heart sank as he gave me a magazine and lay down on the bed to masturbate as usual. I guessed the offer of a lolly had been one of his unkind jokes, but after a few minutes he asked again. Do you want a lollipop then? Yes, I said, hoping that would mean he'd finished relieving himself. Where are they? Come here, he said, and as I leaned across he grabbed my head. Suck this. Before I knew what was happening, he'd forced himself into my mouth, and I felt like I was suffocating. As I instinctively struggled to get away, he became angry. Tears were streaming down my face, and I was gagging and choking, certain it was going to kill me. I couldn't breathe because this thing was so huge. He kept thrusting it further and further down my throat, pushing harder on the back of my head, impaling me so I couldn't pull away. There was no way I could think of other things while this was going on. There was no escape, either physically or mentally, from this new torture. Eventually, he let me go, and just lay there laughing at me. I felt so stupid for allowing him to trick me with the promise of a lollipop. What had made me think for a single second that he would have given me a treat for no reason? Why did I still hold out to the hope that he would want to be kind to me, at least occasionally? Once I could breathe again, I also felt foolish for thinking I was going to die a few minutes before, wondering if perhaps I'd been making a fuss about nothing. If Dad thought it was just a joke, maybe it wasn't such a big deal after all. I hated him and loved him and felt sorry for him and for myself, all at the same time. I always made excuses for him when he drank, but I couldn't find any excuses for him doing that to me. It was too disgusting and too frightening. When he started trying to have penetrative sex with me, I was even more terrified and convinced I was going to die. His horrible fat thing was so big, I thought it was going to split me in two as he tried to force it in between my legs. I imagined my whole body would tear in half, and I would dissolve into nothingness. He was huge, drunk, and awful at moments like that. He smelled vile. This great, heavy man lying on top of me, trying to jab his way into me, not caring if I screamed and cried from the pain. I was certain something terrible was going to happen to me. He licked his fingers to wet me down below. This'll make it easier, he said. Please don't, I pleaded over and over again. Just relax, he said, taking no notice of my sobbing. Stop making such a bloody fuss. It'll be over a lot quicker and it won't hurt so much. I tried to do as he told me because I wanted it over as quickly as possible. I knew there was no point fighting because of the size of him. He was so big and strong, and because he was my daddy. I believed him when he said I had to do it. I suppose it was like when a parent tells a child they have to take a nasty-tasting medicine the doctor has prescribed, or that they need to roll up their sleeve for a painful injection because in the long run it may save their life. I knew that some things have to be done just because the grown-ups say so. I assumed this must be one of those things because that's what he told me. I wish he didn't smell so bad though. He would have started the day by showering and shampooing and dousing himself in Brut or Old Spice. But by the time he'd spent a long day in the pub, those smells were drowned out by the stink of smoke and alcohol that clung to his skin and his breath and his hair, filling my nostrils and making me feel sick. Once he'd finished, he would always laugh at me. See, it wasn't that bad, was it? There wouldn't have been any point in telling him just how terrible it had been, because either he wouldn't have believed me, or he would have been angered by my ingratitude for all he did for me. After the first time, he said, now you've done it once, You can start doing it for money." His words filled me with dread, even though I didn't quite understand what he meant, and even though he didn't actually do anything about it at that stage. If it hurts this much, when he did it, surely he couldn't mean to make me do it with other men. I hoped with all my heart that wasn't what he meant. Once he knew he could get away with penetrating me, he wanted to do it all the time. Sometimes it seemed as though he was deliberately trying to court danger, as if taking the risk of getting caught was part of the thrill for him, showing that he wasn't frightened of anyone, that he was above the law and could do whatever he wanted. There was a scrubby piece of woodland, sandwiched between two roads in Norwich, and a couple of times he detoured and deliberately took me in there on our way back from the pubs and the betting shops. There were cars roaring past just a few yards either side of us while he was attempting to fuck me, like he was daring the outside world to try to stop him doing whatever he wanted. I couldn't understand why he didn't just wait a few more minutes until we got home, but I would never have found the courage to ask. I was still just running behind him like a puppy, eager to please him in any way I could, always hoping not to be hurt too much in the process, terrified of being rejected. I'd given up expecting any affection a long time ago. Always looking for new ways to make easy money, Dad did up our bedrooms a bit and got a string of lodgers in, moving Terry and me into his room to share a bed with him. A situation that we both hated but dared not complain about. He would make me sleep next to him because he said Terry kicked too much in his sleep. I was always frightened when he was lying next to me, but it was worse if I knew he'd been drinking and would be wanting to fill me up with Terry asleep on the other side of me. It was still disgusting to me, even once Dad had fallen asleep, and I never got used to the stale smell of alcohol wafting across the pillow into my face as he snored away. When Mum walked out and he lost her income, money had become really tight. It certainly didn't occur to him to work himself, and he had to rely on coming up with new scams, the whole time just to survive. When he got awarded custody of Terry and me as a single parent, he gloated to anyone who would listen that he would never have to work again because our child benefits would be his meal ticket. It wasn't long before he realised he needed more than our benefit checks to maintain a drinking habit as generous as his. As well as paying him rent, some of the lodgers provided him with yet another source of income because their gyros would come to the house and he would nick them off the doormat before they saw them. He would then get me to forge their signatures and take their gyros up to the post office in another area of the city to get the cash. It only happened a few times before the police came round and took a specimen of Dad's writing to match it up to the signatures. It didn't occur to them to take a sample of my writing. Who would expect a shy little 9-year-old girl to be forging gyros? "You can't get done for this," Dad would assure me if I got nervous and asked if I would be sent to prison, "because you're not legally responsible until you're 10 years old." Most of the lodgers only stayed a few days at a time, and often they left because Dad had picked a fight with them. The only ones that I can remember clearly were 2 young lads, one of whom was really good-looking and sweet. Terry and I were sitting with him one afternoon talking and eating a packet of chocolate biscuits that Nanny had dropped round the day before, when Dad arrived home. Any sort of biscuits were a bit of a rarity in our house, and we certainly never had chocolate ones as a rule, so I think Terry and I had assumed they belonged to the lodgers. Dad must have been looking forward to a chocolate biscuit with his tea all the way home, and when he saw what was happening, he exploded. He took all his anger out on the lodger, beating the guy to a pulp in front of us, splattering the sitting room in his blood as he punched and kicked and threw him around, accusing him of stealing his biscuits. Terry and I tried to explain it was our fault, but he wouldn't listen. He got together all the lodger's stuff and hurled it out into the street. Even though I was only little, I remember wondering why he would react so violently over a packet of biscuits, when all he had to do was buy another one. Looking back now, I realise it may have been because he saw I liked the boy and he felt that there was a threat to his total control of the home. He wouldn't have wanted Terry and me to have any heroes other than him. I felt so guilty about the punishment that lad suffered, certain as always that it was all my fault. Another lodger left the front gate open and our dog got lost. So we got a beating too before being thrown out onto the street. It was as though Dad had a problem with any rival males on his patch, even when they were paying him rent. It was never possible to predict his reactions to anything. Sometimes he would explode over something that no one else had noticed, and at other times we would be shaking in our boots in anticipation of a bad reaction, and he would be fine. It all added to our insecurity and increased his power over us, keeping us off balance and nervous all the time. He had a certificate framed on the lounge wall that was something to do with him being a member of the Freemasons. It was his pride and joy, and when Terry and I smashed the glass one day playing ball indoors, we both thought we were going to be dead meat. When he got home, there was no way we could do anything to disguise the breakage or mend it, so we were quaking with fear by the time he came through the door, both of us apologising and begging for mercy. "Don't worry about it," he grinned, as if we were silly to make a fuss about something so trivial. "We can always get some new glass." Working on his favourite principle, that we were too young to be arrested, he sent Terry and me out shoplifting for him, more and more frequently. He might have started with us being instructed to bring back just a packet of bacon or some other much-needed food, but he soon developed a habit of ordering us to steal bottles of whisky that he could share out with his mates. As he was handing the whisky round at home, he would be boasting to them about his clever little shoplifting daughter, as though I'd just won a prize. I would burst with pride as he sung my praises, and his mates would stare at me in amazement, not realising that I only did it because he forced me to. If only he could have been proud of me when I played the violin or did well at school. I always seemed to get away with nicking the whisky for him. I suppose it never occurred to the shopkeepers that a little girl would do that sort of thing, so they didn't bother to watch me too carefully when I went to that area of the shop. To make it even more difficult, he was always really particular about the brands he would accept. It had to be Teachers or White Horse. Sometimes he would come out on these raids with us himself, acting like a ringmaster. There was a bicycle that was always parked in the same place round the back of the supermarket, with a satchel behind the saddle. He would stand beside it and take the bottles from me, sending me straight back in for more, storing them in the satchel until I had brought them 3 or 4. Then he would fish them out and we would head home triumphantly. He thought it was brilliant that he'd train me like this, feeling he was outwitting the law, although I hated having to steal. I was proud to think that I'd finally found a way to please him and show him I wasn't completely useless. One time, when he sent Terry and me out to steal whisky on our own, we decided we would pinch some sweets instead, since we were hungry as usual, and that was the one time we were caught. I guess shopkeepers watch more carefully when kids are hovering around the sweets counter than around the off-licensed shelves. Although I was terrified of what was going to happen to us when the police were called, there was a part of me that was relieved, because I thought that now we'd been caught, Dad would realise he shouldn't send us out anymore, that it was too risky. When the police took us home and told him what had happened, he put on a great act of being the outraged parent, assuring them that he would be giving us both a hiding and would be making sure we never did such a terrible thing again, calling us the little sods. I hated it when he behaved like that, all his bravado gone, just craven and cowardly, and lying to save his own skin. Once the police had gone, he was even more furious with us. Not because of the dishonesty, obviously, and not because we got ourselves caught, although he saw that as more evidence of how useless we were, but because we had disobeyed him and gone for the sweets rather than the whiskey. He sent us straight back out again to make good our mistake. "Don't come back until you've each got a bottle for me," he ordered. Terry was in floods of tears by then, certain that he just couldn't go back out there after everything we'd already been through that day. So I had to do it for both of us. I never minded doing things for Terry because he was always kind to me when he had a chance. We were in this together. Dad would hide the bottles we brought home under the settee, delighted yet again at the idea of getting something for nothing, bringing them out when his friends arrived so they could spend the nights drinking and playing cards. The fact that they'd come free added to the pleasure he took in them. His aversion to paying for anything meant that he didn't even like buying toilet paper, preferring to go into public toilets in little villages and nicking the giant rolls they provided. He would happily boast to everyone who would listen that he hadn't bought toilet paper for years, as he believed that anyone who did so was a fool. Although he did buy the Jaguar at one stage, most of the time he didn't have a car and he would get friends to drive him around. He loved to go out poaching, shooting rabbits or pheasants or whatever because it meant free food, and at the same time it fed his illusion that he was above the normal petty rules that everyone else lived by. He liked guns too, owning little rifles that he would fire out the kitchen window at passing birds. He often hit them because he was a good shot, and he taught me how to do it too. I loved it when he taught me how to do relatively normal things like a real parent should, rather than teaching me how to steal and cheat and eventually sell myself on the streets. He may have rejected society's rules, but he did have his own code of morality. He would never pinch money out of someone's purse, for instance. That would have seemed dishonest to him, although he had always been happy to take every penny Mum earned on the streets straight out of her hands, seeing it as his, much as hers. Sometimes, when he had company in the evenings, Dad would send Terry and me upstairs to bed. But at others, he liked us to stay up and be with the party till 1 or 2 in the morning, especially me. He would force me to drink whiskey, watered down with orange, even though the sour taste made me gag to start with until my system grew used to it. Terry and I always preferred to be sent to bed so we could get some sleep, because we wanted to go to school the following day. But there was no point arguing with him once he'd made up his mind. He wanted us downstairs with him. On other nights, the exact opposite would happen, and he would want to be rid of us as early as possible. If he'd banished us to bed for some reason, then we weren't allowed downstairs under any conditions at all, and sometimes that could happen as early as 4 in the afternoon. As the only toilet was downstairs out the back, we nearly always needed to relieve ourselves at some stage during the evening. Since the idea of defying him was unthinkable, we just had to find a way to do it upstairs. But we never had the nerve to pee out the window like him. Terry was okay, since he could stand up and pee into the water tank in Dad's bedroom. Although I dread to think where that water ended up. I suppose we were probably drinking it downstairs or washing in it. I couldn't reach the tank, so I would have to pull back the carpet and relieve myself on the floorboards underneath. In the general filth and stench of our bedrooms, Dad never noticed what we were being forced to do. We didn't know what was going on downstairs once we were exiled to the bedroom, but we would hear some pretty funny noises, and we knew he kept his private stash of pornographic magazines under the cushion of his chair. Since most of his friends were alcoholics or prostitutes, it isn't hard to guess what was happening. I really liked most of the prostitutes he had as friends because they were nearly always nice to me, and Dad would behave better towards me when they were around. Maybe they could instinctively understand what lay in store for me because similar things probably happened to them when they were young. There was one black prostitute called Gail, who I thought was lovely and who was one of the few people able to really terrify Dad. Gail was great and used to get me to babysit for her when she was out working, sometimes bringing the punters back to her house while I was there. It didn't seem that unusual to me. It was the sort of thing I saw happening all the time around me. I suppose on some level I knew she was doing the same things Dad made me do with him, but I tried not to think about it too much. Gail was as hard as nails. She was sex mad and really wanted Dad. Although he loved sex and would boast that he could never resist fucking everything in sight, Gail made him uneasy. He liked to be the one in control, the one doing the seducing or the raping. He and Gail would go upstairs together at all times of the day, and Terry and I would be able to hear them fighting or fucking or whatever else they were doing through the floor. I admired her for not just giving in to him like most people did. She once smacked him over the head with a pool cue in one of the pubs on the block. She was great. I admired people who had the courage to fight back, who didn't let someone like Dad bully them, and I wished I could have been more like that myself. Another of Dad's best friends was a prostitute called Lucy. I loved Lucy. She was a real little firecracker of a woman who had something of the gypsy about her. Dad always used to nag her like mad for being too skinny, but she never took any offence at anything he said. I don't think there was anything ever sexual between them. They were just really good mates. And she was another of the handful of women who was willing to stand up to him and argue back about the things. Men don't like skinny women, he'd tease her, but she wouldn't let him undermine her confidence or get to her like he got to everyone else. She was always turning up at the house in the middle of the night, covered in bruises after being beaten up by one or other of her pimps, or all of whom called themselves her boyfriends. Each time it happened, Dad would take her in and clean her up, and Terry and I would find her asleep on the settee in the morning when we came downstairs. There was no doubting what she did for a living, because she always dressed for the part in revealing tops, tight little miniskirts and high heels. She would be out on the game every night, but she never seemed to have any money in her purse. I guess she just drank it and gave it away. A lot of prostitutes are like that. Because the money doesn't seem respectable, you end up frittering it away in your ways you would never dream of doing if you'd earned it in a shop or a factory or any other decent profession. Easy come, easy go. It always felt like dirty money, rather than something to be saved and looked after. When Lucy was there, she would constantly be sending me out to the shops to buy her a new pair of tights or hairspray or a comb or something. I loved running errands for her because she would always tell me to get myself some sweets while I was there, and I wanted to please her anyway. Even when I was too young to really understand what the word meant, I knew she was a prostitute, but I didn't care because I loved her for who she was. One day, when I was 9, I came back from the shops with some new tights she'd sent me for. "Let Ria try those tights on," Dad said, and Lucy handed them over to me without really thinking. Like any little girl, I was eager to dress up like a grown-up and pulled them on happily, wanting to look as glamorous as Lucy always seemed to be. "Try Lucy's shoes on," Dad said once I got the tights on. I did what he told me, strutting awkwardly around the room, about 6 inches taller than usual. "Try Lucy's skirt on," he said. Lucy was obviously beginning to feel uncomfortable because she said she didn't want to play that game anymore and tried to distract Dad. But I thought she was being a right spoilsport. Dad and I both begged her until she gave in and reluctantly handed over the skirt. I wriggled myself into it, pleased to see how grown up my legs looked, stretching out below in tights and stilettos. She's got legs just like her mum, Dad said approvingly as he watched my vampish little performance. That seemed to be a huge compliment because he was always going on about Mum's legs and what a fantastic figure she had. When she's old enough, he told Lucy, I'm going to put her on the game. She's going to make me a fortune. I'm sure Lucy knew all about his plans anyway, because he never made any secret of them, but she didn't like him flaunting it like that in front of me. She's too young for you to be dressing her up like that, she protested. Put some makeup on her then, Dad said, ignoring her. As I was begging her to make me look grown up too, she gave in. With a grim face, she painted some eye makeup on and lipstick on me. And when I saw the results in the mirror, I felt like the prettiest girl in the world. She looked silly, Lucy said when she finished, and I felt as though my balloon had been punctured. I thought I looked beautiful, and it seemed to me that Dad did too. But I respected Lucy, and I didn't want to seem silly in her eye. So I went off quickly to change back into my normal clothes and wash my face. As I wiped off the makeup, I remember thinking that, although I had enjoyed dressing up, I didn't want to be a prostitute. Whatever it might involve, not even to please Dad. Lucy's going upstairs to do the business, Dad used to say when she brought a punter back to our place. And I knew that's what prostitutes did. The business. That was how they earned money. More than that, I didn't want to think about. But I knew for certain at the age of 9 that it wasn't what I wanted to do when I grew up.